All right. Good morning. Welcome to Thursday, the day before Friday, which is the day before a long weekend. Although it looks like it's going to be pretty snowy, so it might be. I was going to say it might be an indoor weekend, but probably most people were going to stay indoors anyway, being that it's winter and being there is a pandemic still on. But yeah, so we'll have a bit of a long weekend. You can stay inside, stay warm, eat and sleep, and watch movies and whatever it is that you people do. Let's see who's here. So Basil's here this morning. Good morning to you. And Irene is here. Good morning. Hadil is here. Good morning, Hadil. Michelle is here. Good morning. Michelle is here. Adon is here. Good morning. And so, yeah, and so anyone else who's tuning in this morning is obviously welcome as well. There's no issues there. Yeah, so let's jump in, okay? So yesterday we continued talking about India and kind of the beginnings of Indian culture. We said that there was kind of an ancient civilization that appeared on the banks of the Indus River and on the around the sort of tributaries that flow into the Indus. And it seemed like this civilization flourished for about 1,000 years. And so they had a few big cities with lots of monumental architecture and irrigation and sanitation systems like sewers and drains, and they grew things and they had domesticated animals, and there was all kinds of cultural complexity. And we said that unfortunately up until very recently we weren't able to fully decipher their alphabet, and as Amanpreet pointed out to us, that is actually beginning to happen. We're kind of getting to the point where we can start to read some of these things, and so hopefully in the next few years maybe we'll learn more about this civilization. But until then, kind of not the most we can say about it, but all we can say about it for our purposes is that there was this kind of great civilization that flourished in this part of the world 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But then people seem to have moved off, and they were into this area flowed these kind of Vedic Aryans, we're calling them, or Indo-Aryans. And so these people were a sort of nomadic pastoral people, so they seem to have kept cows in order to sustain themselves, but they also did some farming as well. And we have some archaeological evidence of these people, and later information about them comes from these Vedas, right? And so from the Rig Veda, this very old set of hymns, religious hymns that are kind of songs or prayers to the gods, asking people to grant them all of the things that they need, right? And so again, we should probably point out that even though we're trying to imagine what these Indo-Aryans or Vedic Aryans were like, it's tough to figure out because we're looking at archaeological evidence, which can only tell us so much, and we're looking at the Vedas. But keep in mind, the Vedas were first written down about 1,000 years after the Indo-Aryans moved into what is now northern India, right? So if you think that's a long time, right? Imagine archaeologists trying to figure out what our life is like today based on what people write about us in 1,000 years. There is the internet. And that's what I'm saying. Imagine there is no internet, right? So we're really kind of looking back through these writings and trying to imagine what we can tell about these people. But it's you're looking through a very thick lens, right? You're looking through something that is, the Vedas would have acquired some changes over time, and it's not a clear picture, but we do have some idea about what these people were like and where they came from and what they were, what gods they were worshiping and what their lives were like. A little bit anyway. Right. And so this is kind of an important event for the history of India, because the sort of the beginnings of northern Indian culture will come from those people that were moving out of the Indus River Valley civilizations and the kind of influx of these Indo-Aryans from the northwest. That will sort of begin to mix and will form kind of the basis for northern Indian culture as we go forward, okay? I'm just going to jump through some of this because we talked about it already. The religious ideas and the family structure that we were able to pull from the Vedas. We talked about all of that. Oh yeah, and so yesterday we started talking about, or we started watching this documentary called The Story of India, right? And so I thought that was super interesting. There were some very interesting insights that came out of that. Let me ask you some questions. Number one, in what ways does India preserve an unbroken thread of human history? Yeah, I guess in part that's true, right? So the sort of a more, what's that?
I thought I heard something like that.
You did hear that, yeah. So traditionally speaking, I guess in many parts of the world, you would marry your first cousins, right? And to some degree, that's in some places that's still a bit of a cultural norm. The look on Mulder's face is telling me that it's not a cultural norm where he comes from, nor where I come from. But in many cases, first cousins are kind of preferred marriage partners, or at the very least, they're okay, right? Here in the West, we kind of don't do that. We think first cousins are still family, but that's an important thing to think about as well. The idea of every culture has ideas about kinship. Every culture has ideas about who is in the family and who is outside the family, right? If you think about it, we're all human beings, and so we're all ultimately related in some way, right? Very distantly, but we're all related to each other. And so the line between who is our family and who is outside is kind of arbitrary, right? It's a one that culture creates, and different cultures create those boundaries in different places. And so in some places, first cousins are far enough outside that that's okay, you can marry them. In other places, first cousins are too close, they're still family, right? But no. If you have a child with a first cousin, kind of what happens is that if there are recessive genes in the family, so genes that tend to be overpowered by others, they are more likely to be expressed. Okay, and so if there is a genetic disease in the family, like multiple sclerosis, for instance, there's more chance that that disease will appear because you'll have more chance of two recessive genes combining. If you keep the gene pool too narrow for too long over generations, then yes, you can start to see some things. But if you were to go out and marry your cousin tomorrow and have a baby with them, it'd probably be fine. But if it continues for a long period, then you can have some things coming out. We talked about Tutankhamun. What's that?
What's the difference between first cousins? Because we're still not there.
What's the difference between?
I still don't get it. Like, why would they name it first cousin, second cousin?
Oh, I get a little confused about this as well. So
they're cousins. What's the difference? The second part.
and that's the other part of kinship as well, is that what we call people in our family is also determined by culture. And so who we think of as cousins or second cousins or whatever, that's culturally determined as well. So some people might just think of everyone as cousins, second, third, first, it doesn't make a difference, they're all the same. Other cultures might actually go to the trouble of naming them. What's that? Like, They do, I think, because some genes actually run in families, right? So if you have a history of if you have a history of MS, if you have a history of multiple sclerosis in your family, then you might be a carrier for that gene, but you might not get it, right? You might not get MS. But if it runs in the family, that means that maybe your cousins are carrying that gene too. And so if you marry someone from outside the family, the odds of them carrying that gene are lower. If you marry someone from within the family, the odds of them carrying that gene are higher. And the odds of that gene being expressed in your child are also a little bit higher.
I guess, like, if genes are first cousin and the second cousin,
Yeah.
makes no difference, right?
I think you would see a little more difference. There'd be a little more genetic variability. Because if you look at your brother and sister, or if you look at your siblings, for instance, half of their DNA comes from one parent and half comes from the other, right? Just like with you. So you and your brother and sister, or you and your siblings share a lot of genes. But if you have someone who has even if you have a sibling that has a different father, for instance, then there's different genes coming in, and so they're more genetically different from you. And so kind of the more genes that are feeding in, the more genetically distinct they might be. So a second cousin might be a slightly more diverse or different genetically than a
first cousin is the closest, right?
Yeah. So
Closest cousin.
first cousins are the children of your aunts and uncles,
Okay.
right? So your father or your mother's brothers and sisters. Those are your first cousins. Second cousins, I think, are the children of those cousins. Is that correct?
Children of our parents' cousins. Is that it?
The children of your parents' cousins, perhaps.
I don't get it.
I don't get it either, because my family isn't so tight that I actually even know who those people are. So I've never actually bothered to figure out who my second cousins are, because I don't know. But yeah, they would have more genetic diversity because they're married to people from outside as well. So kind of the further out you go, the more genetically distinct people are from you, and the less likelihood that you're going to have genetic diseases appear or any sort of genetic issue. But some of the things, like, again, if you, this is gross, but if you married your sibling tomorrow and had a baby, the baby would probably be okay, like it wouldn't come out, with 3 arms or anything like that. It would probably be fine. It's not the best idea, because again, if you're a carrier for some sort of genetic disease, there's a higher percentage that disease will actually appear in your child, but it's not something you should do. But again, it doesn't mean that, you're not going to have kids with 3 eyes or anything like that. It's not going to be that bad. But again, over time, if a group of people continually interbreed, then you're going to have lots of genetic recessive genes showing up. Then you're going to have genetic diseases and things like that. So, yeah. So we said Tutankhamun, for instance, had a few genetic issues and diseases to deal with, but he was probably the product of, a few generations of very close marriages, right? Whereas, yeah. Anyway, okay, so cousin marriage in this part of the world might be more common, and so that does help to preserve this thread of human history. But what else did they talk about? Yeah, so that part of the world, southern India, was populated by humans probably in some of the first migrations of Homo sapiens out of Africa, right? So Homo sapiens seem to evolve in Africa. They start to spread out around 60 or 70,000 years ago, and they start to move into what's now the Middle East. And then they kind of find their way along the sort of lower coast of Asia, and they find their way into southern India. And we can actually do genetic tests to see how closely people are related to those original populations. And interestingly, there are pretty significant groups of people in southern India that still carry that same gene from that original migration. So there's people that left Africa. The first human beings, the first Homo sapiens to leave Africa, left Africa, settled in southern India, and their descendants are still there. 60,000 years later, those people are actually directly related to the first people to actually leave Africa, which is amazing, right? Incredible kind of unbroken thread of human history from that first migration out to all the way to present day. Unbelievable. So they're in that part of the world, and the host, whose name I don't remember, the host of the show, says that there's something very interesting about the mantras and the chants that those Brahmins are using. And so those Brahmins are kind of priests or holy people, and we saw one Brahmin teaching that young child some of the chants, and then we saw this sort of purification ritual with lots of fire that took 12 days. But what was interesting about their chants? Yeah, so those chants are, people don't really understand them anymore because they're not in any known language, right? They are actually older than Hindi, they're older than Sanskrit, they're older than the sort of indigenous languages that people actually speak in that southern part of India. Those chants are older than that. They have a structure, right? So they seem to have a grammar and an organization to them. So they do represent a language, but no language that exists anymore. They're actually older than that. And what do they almost sound like in some cases? They are sung, right? Lots of them are kind of melodic. What's that? Not a what?
Not like a pattern.
Oh, not like a pattern?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Right. What else do they sound like? Well, in a way, that's what they said, right? They said that in some ways, the sort of melodic structure of these chants and the way they're put together actually sound like bird songs. They seem to be structured like bird songs. And so it's very interesting that these things still exist, and they have been passed down orally for generations and generations, right? We're talking about these Vedic Aryans that come into northern India around, 3,800 years ago. But these chants that these Brahmins are using are older than that, right? They predate Sanskrit. They're in a language that nobody speaks anymore, right? And so these chants that they're using, these prayers and hymns that these Brahmins are saying, are older than 4,000 years. And they're word for word passed down, right? If any of you are kind of religious, or if you're a Christian, for example, if you go to church today, people will often say the Lord's Prayer. Have you heard the Lord's Prayer? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That's a very old prayer, but it's also been translated and edited quite a number of times, right? It was probably written in Hebrew to begin with, and then ancient Greek, and then Latin. Now it's been translated into all kinds of languages around the world. I learned it in English, but it's gone through a lot of changes, right? We're not saying it, we don't say the Lord's Prayer in the original Hebrew composition with the exact same words, but these people are doing just that. They have preserved the exact wording and the exact kind of melody of the words for thousands and thousands of years, right? Unbelievable, that consistency, right? And again, I think I'm not sure if it was a professor who was there or if it was one of the people, but he said, we can't write these things down. They're passed orally, right? We teach them, and you learn them, and you memorize them, and you pass them on. They're not written down. And there's well, anthropologists could do it, but there's not even a language to write it down because the language doesn't exist anymore, nor does any writing form that would have encoded it. So it's just been passed down orally for thousands of years. And we don't even know how many thousands. It could be, those chants could be 10,000 years old for all we know. Unbelievable. I think number 3, the geneticists, I think we kind of answered that question with number 1, right? The idea that these people are direct genetic descendants of the original people to leave Africa. Unbelievable. After that, our host, whatever his name was, he actually goes to Harappa, right? We were talking about the Indus River Valley civilizations, and the big cities were Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. He actually goes to Harappa, kind of pokes around. And why were Western scholars so surprised when they discovered this ancient civilization in this part of the world? They thought that they were the only ones. So we already knew about, ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. We already knew about those civilizations, right? Why else might they have been surprised? Okay, they were definitely focused on the ones they already knew.
I'm not so sure that the Indian music priest or doctors got to know the first men who was the first man.
No, I think it's kind of after that. It's after that part. Part of it has to do with it has to do with racism a little bit. Has to do with racism, because Western scholars believe that, at the time, this is 100 years ago, but even prior to that, people in Western culture, particularly people in Britain and the UK, felt that they were like the highest form of culture, right? And Western culture traces its roots back to ancient Rome, right? And before that, ancient Greece. And to some degree, even to Egypt and to Mesopotamia. That's the line that Western civilization likes to draw for itself. And so, to a Western kind of, Western mind, yeah, this makes sense, right? The first great civilizations were in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and those led to great civilizations in Greece and Rome, and that led to us, and we're a great civilization too, right? So they kind of told themselves this story of, progress being a Western thing, right? And that you can draw a direct line from the first complex civilizations all the way to Western culture. And then, whoops, these guys discover an ancient civilization in India, a place that they probably viewed as kind of backward or primitive or underdeveloped, right? So that was kind of shocking to them, and maybe it shouldn't have been, but it was shocking because of the way they had thought about progress and the way they thought about their own culture and the way that they kind of looked down upon Indian culture. And so here it was a bit of a shock to them to discover that India actually had its own great civilization thousands of years before, right? And so their kind of trajectory of ancient civilization to the modern world, that wasn't the only one, right? There are other great civilizations, and as we'll talk about, China is another one that has a great civilization appearing very early on in its history. And so, yeah, it's a little bit of prejudice. It's a little bit of looking down on Indian culture and wondering, oh gosh, how could these backward people have had such a great civilization? And again, a part of that is prejudice, right? Part of that is Western scholars thinking that they're the most advanced culture around, which is not the case. Did you catch that? How many people might have lived in these Indus River? I think some of the cities might have held about 200,000 people. But over the whole kind of area, yeah, up to 5 million people were living in the Indus River Valley civilization before it kind of declined, right? Cities of 200,000 people. That's a lot of people living in one place for this point in history, right? And again, what did we hear about the end of the Indus River Valley civilization? What do they tell us? Yeah, climate change, right? Thought it was a modern problem. Guess not. So what did climate change do to this part of the world? Yeah, but explain that a little more if you can. Yeah, the conclusion is that climate change caused people to leave, but what are the premises? Flood. What about flooding or lack thereof? Yeah, so it seems that the rivers weren't flooding the way they used to, right? All these ancient civilizations rely on the sort of habitual, the regular flooding of the river to irrigate their fields and to deposit fresh organic soil onto their fields, right? And that seems not to have been happening. And why not? What wasn't coming in the same strength? Yeah, the monsoon, right? The great rains that come to that part of the world at certain times of the year. The monsoon was not coming at the right time, or they were light monsoons that were happening. And so it's interesting to think about, the Earth's climate is kind of fluctuating all the time, right? And it's causing some places to get warmer and drier, like in Egypt. Some places are getting cooler and wetter. Monsoons are becoming heavier, or in this case, monsoons are becoming lighter. And it's kind of pushing people around on the landscape, right? People have to move to wherever they can survive, right? And sometimes it means they have to abandon one place where they lived and move into a new place. In some cases, like the Indo-Aryans, it might have actually created room for them to move in, right? Maybe they didn't move into the Indus River Valley for all those years because the Harappan civilizations were already there. But when those people started to move out, maybe the Vedic Aryans said, oh good, there's more room for us, let's expand into this part of the world, right? And so climate change kind of pushes and pulls people around in the ancient world because they have to go to where the land can provide for them.
So we can conclude from that, us, our new generation, what the biggest factors of the cause factories.
Say that one more time. We can conclude that.
Our generation or middle generation is like the biggest impact on the planet.
Ooh. So,
It was like a long time
So I guess the statement or the argument here, I guess, is that because climate change has been a factor in people's lives for thousands of years, that we can conclude that our generation or our few generations are not the biggest impactor of climate change on Earth. Can you say that?
because when the first factory is started, small chemical union.
What do we think about that statement, people? You don't agree with that? Why not? What's that? We made it worse?
Well, have you seen any country removed from the
No, no.
the physical placement of the continents.
Yeah.
I don't by physical.
Yeah.
But people are moving.
Yeah.
People are moving.
Well, and that's kind of an interesting question because, here we're talking about people being kind of moved around on the landscape by changing climates, but there's also a lot less people on the planet than there are now, right? I don't have a good estimate of how many people live on Earth, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, but it's probably nowhere close to the number of people that live on Earth now, right? Entire countries cannot just pick up and move one way or the other. There's too many people. But it is worth saying that, we are, the Earth's climate has sort of cyclically changed for its entire history, for billions of years, really. But we do have a species on the planet now that is pretty drastically changing how the world works, right? The Earth is kind of a biological machine, and it kind of operates in one way, but we are changing that, right? And we're changing it in a way that we don't really know what the outcome is going to be, because our goal is not climate change, right? Our goal is to enjoy our lives and be comfortable, right? That's what our goal is. And so how the climate is actually affected with that is really, it's not entirely clear how that's going to come out, but the signs don't look that good, right? Signs don't look that good. So I don't know. I would disagree with you, Bahan. I would say that, it is important to remember that yes, climate change has been a constant factor for all of human history, all of the Earth's history, but we are accelerating that. We are accelerating the sort of rate of change, so how fast it changes, and we're accelerating the sort of extremes of those changes. And I would argue that we don't really know what we're doing, right? We're playing with a machine that we cannot really control, and it could be bad, because here we have an entire civilization of people that, because the climate shifted, they couldn't live there anymore, and they had to just pick up and move, right? They built cities and canals and temples and all kinds of things, and they basically had to walk away from it all because they couldn't live there anymore. And again, this is a much simpler time, simpler technology, but it's probably worth learning the lesson that, because the climate changed, these people could not make a living there anymore, and they had to move. And for them, fortunately, they were able to. But the question is, will we be able to move in such a way that will allow us to continue to exist if the climate changes significantly? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. But I would probably disagree that the fact that climate change existed in the past doesn't necessarily prove that we aren't influencing it now.
Imagine we are not speaking this, and then when people like they hear about climate change, they will hear about we are causing it, we are doing it.
Oh yeah.
It's been there for a long time.
It's definitely fair to say that we are not causing climate change, right? So that is fair to say. Are we making it worse is another question. But yeah, it's very fair to say we didn't cause climate change. Climates have been shifting on Earth for millions of years. The Earth has been warmer than it is now. It's been colder than it is now. There has been more oxygen and less oxygen, and more carbon dioxide and less carbon dioxide. The oceans have been higher and lower in different places. All of Canada was covered in ice, a kilometer thick, 20,000 years ago. I mean, yeah, it's been crazy, right? Things have changed over time, for sure. Okay, so where does that bring us? Right. So just as a quick review here, India preserves some kind of unchanged genetic markers from that first sort of migration out of Africa. And so it's that M130 gene was the one that they were using to kind of identify this group. And so, yeah, this people living in there's people living in South India that are direct descendants of the first people to arrive there. Unbelievable. Yeah, and so we can chart this back by looking at mitochondrial DNA. And so you can kind of see some of these migration patterns and where people that carried certain genes kind of moved at different times, right? So you can see there's an early group of people that follow that coast, the southern Asian coast. There's people that kind of go overland and find their way into China and to sort of Southeast Asia. There's people that populate the islands through the same route. And so we can actually trace this. We can look at people's DNA now, and we can trace back through mitochondrial DNA how people are related to each other through time. Kind of interesting, right? No? Super boring? Kind of? Yeah, and so I showed you this graphic a little bit earlier in the course, and again, you can see this is how we've pieced it together through looking at not only archaeology, but through the human genome. We can sort of count mutations back, we can see how populations are related to each other, and we can construct some sort of a picture for humans leaving, evolving in Africa, leaving Africa, some stay behind, of course, and sort of spreading out throughout the entire world. Yeah, the mantras that these Brahmins use are probably thousands of years old, predating any language that anyone speaks, and maybe even predating, any kind of Indian culture as we now know it. Right? They're very, very old. Really cool, amazing. Again, the sort of surprise at discovering an ancient civilization in India was a little bit ethnocentric, right? The Western science wanted to trace its roots back through Mesopotamia and Greece and Rome and say that, yes, of course they were a great civilization because they come from a great civilization. But lo and behold, there are other great civilizations in the world as old or older than the ones in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And the Indus River here and the civilization that appears around the Yellow and the Yangtze River in China are other examples, right? And finally, we might have seen climate change resulting in part of a reason why the Indus River Valley civilization ends. And so those people are forced to kind of abandon their homes and their cities because the monsoon's not coming, the river is not flooding or not flowing, and so you got to move, right? Even if you've built up this grand city over 1,000 years, no water in the river means no crops, means no food, and people have to find another way, right? Okay, I'd like to show you a little more of the story of India, but I think maybe we'll take a break first, and then we'll come back and watch, okay? So take a break, come back, and then we'll watch some more of Story of India. All right, and we are back. So we've kind of reviewed what we saw on the story of India, yesterday, about the sort of where the first Indians come from and the fact that some people are still there. There are these ancient kind of cultures and religions and languages that we really only have even just a glimpse of existing, right? We don't even know what these people were doing, but they were there and they were chanting these things thousands and thousands of years before anything that looks anything like modern Indian culture appears, right? So there's very ancient roots to this part of the world. Yeah, we talked a little bit about the Indus River civilizations, which we have, and of course that those kind of ended as people moved out. And now we're kind of entering a different phase of Indian history, which is what our host was telling us. And so we'll see a little bit about, we'll learn a little bit about language. And so this researcher, William Jones, discovered something after he was taught how to read Sanskrit by a Brahmin priest. So a little bit of language decoding or language decipherment. We'll learn a little bit about the Aryans, which we already have, but we'll get to see some more about them. We'll hear about Soma, which might be interesting. We'll hear about the excavation of an archaeological site in Turkmenistan. But this site will have some significance for the history of India as well. And so we'll learn about all those things. So this will catch us up into the sort of Indo-Aryan Vedic age that we've already read about. Any questions before we dive in? Okay, so online people, the story of India is in Microsoft Teams, of course. And what I'll ask you to do is watch this section here. So from 2611, that's where we stopped yesterday, all the way to 4715. That's what we'll watch. So about 20 minutes, give or take, today. Okay. So online people, I'll let you watch this. And then when we come back, we'll talk about some of these questions, okay? So try to keep an eye out. All right. So very quickly, where's my output here? Here we go. So very quickly, what does William Jones discover when he gets a Brahmin priest to teach him Sanskrit?
Language are very similar.
Which languages? What's that?
And the Sanskrit language
The Sanskrit language was what?
and the Indian language are similar.
The main language that is currently spoken in India is Hindi, and Hindi is like a child language of Sanskrit. Sanskrit's an older parent version. So Sanskrit has some similarities to what languages? Greek and Persian and Latin, right? Which is not what you would think, right? Those ancient Greece and ancient Rome and ancient India are thousands of miles away from each other, right? How would how could that possibly be, right? How could these languages be so similar in terms of some of their words? And William Jones suggested that actually it's because they have the same grandparent language, right? There's a group of people who come earlier who seem to be speaking an earlier form of language. And as people start to move away and move into the Middle East and into Europe and then into India, that original language continues to evolve and develop. And so the languages change, but they also retain some similarities, right? Especially for words that are very traditional and unlikely to change, right? So, mother and father are very traditional terms, right? And they are unlikely to change significantly over the course of history, right? And so, it's not like, so words like that have a tendency to sort of show the relationship between languages. And again, if you look at other languages as well, you'll see that pater, mater pattern holds up for a lot of languages. There are a lot of languages that have a very similar word for father and mother. So I guess we kind of answered that. How he did it, he compared words, right? He compared words that existed in multiple languages, and he saw how sort of similar or different they were. What are some of the things that we learned about from the Aryans from these early written sources? That's when he was at the library with that the Indian woman, the professor. What were they talking about? They in part they were talking about horses, right? What was the big deal with horses?
They thought they didn't know about horses. They were not contacted with horses, but they appeared to be when they found the
Yeah. So in these Aryan hymns in the Rig Veda, they speak about horses quite a bit, and they seem to be very familiar with horses, and they seem to have trained horses and been around horses a lot. But do horses kind of appear in the Indus River Valley civilization? No, right? So the Indus River Valley civilization doesn't seem to have had domestic horses. The horses came in with these people from Central Asia. What else do we find? Or what else do we hear about? The rain god. We hear a little bit about Indra, right? And the god of the sky and of the rain. What else? About the wagons, yeah. So they reference these four-wheeled wagons or carts, which this Russian archaeologist Viktor Saryanidi seems to have found in his archaeological site. What else did they tell us? Right, and then they also talk about the Soma, right? So what is this? What is this Soma drink? Yeah, it's got a bit of a pharmacological effect, right? So they find this little plant growing and they dry it out. They put it into boiling water, and what's in it? What is?
Better.
Yeah, it tastes bitter. But what's the active ingredient? The twig. What? No, it's ephedrine. Ephedrine. So ephedrine is a stimulant. So almost similar to caffeine in coffee beans. This little plant, whatever it was called, has a naturally occurring stimulant in it. It's ephedrine, and so if you mix it and you drink it, it's like getting a bit of a caffeine buzz. And so he said, yeah, I feel kind of tingly, I feel alert, my heart rate has increased a little bit.
Like found out that you can do that. It's only this like a random outside that you can
That's kind of what it is, right? People would have learned about these things through trial and error, and then they would have passed them down. They would have passed their knowledge down. So yeah, somebody just decided one day, I'm going to boil it up and see what happens, right? And so it turns out that this has a pharmacological effect. It has a drug-like effect on the human mind, which again is not uncommon in human societies. Lots of human societies have substances that they use to alter their mental state one way or another, right? Alcohol is one, of course, which lots of civilizations invent, but they're also aware of plants that can have pharmacological effects, and this is one of them, right? And so so he says, he imagines these Indo-Aryans drinking this drink and kind of, getting a bit of a buzz and, writing some of these hymns or reciting them to Indra as they feel kind of all, as they feel kind of jittery and, keyed up from their ephedrine. Right, so then he takes us to Turkmenistan, to Victor Sarianides' excavation. And why was the city abandoned there? Again, climate change. Yeah, what seems to have happened? They what? They moved west, right? Because what also moved west? Yeah, the river began to move away from their original civilization and began to move west, right? So these big kind of climate patterns are causing people to move around one way or the other, right? And so it seems that there's this group of people living in Central Asia and Turkmenistan with this big city and horses and cattle and farming and all kinds of things. But then as climate changes, some of them are they move west to follow the river as it moves, and some people set out east with their horses, right? And these are these Aryan people that eventually come in to settle in India, coming from Central Asia, from the flat plains with their horses and their carts. Again, showing up here kind of related to the same issues as the Indus River Valley people, right? Who are being pushed out of their home by climate change, and similarly the Aryans are having the same issue, right? They're having to find new land, and so they do. What else? Anything else interesting in that video?
The way, the children, when they start like seeing the ritual, they all like have the same cloth and the same haircut.
Mm-hmm.
The religion, or the
Yeah, we see those young Brahmin boys who are I assume in some sort of kind of school to teach them to be Brahmin priests, and so they're all there kind of learning. They're all kind of wearing the clothes and haircuts that are determined. I don't really know anything about it, to be honest. But yeah, we see them kind of in a, maybe a monastery is not quite the right word, but yeah, they're there kind of learning to be priests, I think. What else? Anything else interesting? Right. So they mentioned that that some of these, these are kind of wagons or carts, I guess, for transporting goods, and maybe they just rode on the back of their horses, I would assume. What else? It's interesting to think, we haven't talked about this very much, but it's interesting to think how early people started to domesticate animals, right? So even by 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, people are domesticating cows and oxen and horses and elephants and sheep and goats and chickens. All of these animals that we kind of are familiar with have already been domesticated, right? Which is very interesting. Dogs, interestingly, are domesticated far earlier. Some people estimating maybe around 30,000 years ago or so. So dogs have been, man's best friend, quote unquote. Dogs have been man's best friend for tens of thousands of years. Before we even started farming, before the agricultural revolution, people had dogs with them. Yeah, they're very helpful if you're a hunter-gatherer, right? To have a dog with you to help you hunt or to help you sniff out prey. Very useful, right? Or to protect you from other animals, right? Yeah, but they're really the only animal that humans have domesticated before agriculture. All the other animals that are now domesticated come after that, including cats. Whether they're domesticated or not is another story, but they live in our houses now. Anything else interesting that we should point out? No? Okay, so I will end it there. Tomorrow we'll come back and we'll look at this next exciting phase of Indian history. This is so cool. I'm really enjoying this. Come back tomorrow. I have a few messages to answer here on Teams, so I'll do that right away. But other than that, I will end it. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a nice afternoon. Ivan, you have to go see Deborah. I don't know why. You did?
Yeah.
Okay. I just was supposed to tell you. I told you. Okay. That's it for today. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good afternoon, okay?